Okay, back down here. We're starting with square one. How do we get from here to resurrection? Now, here's the most common answer. And again, I'll outline both of them this afternoon. So I'm going to go kind of quickly through this reliability deal. But the average Christian response, even among apologists, goes something like this. Well, don't you know that we've got the Gospel of Mark. Now, I'm going to use critics' dating. All right? I'm playing their game, their methodological game. I'm using data for reasons that they establish it, which are actually quite good reasons. I'm talking about the facts here, not the dating. I'm going to move the dating back. But for the sake of this argument, I'm going to use their dates. You're going to see it's not incredibly different. And they're going to date Mark at about 65 to 70 A.D. They're going to date Matthew at about 80. Most evangelicals put it back in the 60s or maybe even a little earlier. Mark is fairly close. Luke at about 85. And everybody puts John, whoa. I think I'm way past something here. John at about 95. Now, subtract 30. This is plus 65, right? Luke is plus 55. Matthew's about plus 50. Mark's 65, 70, minus 30. 35 or 40 years after ground zero. And the average evangelical response is, these are good sources. Even John, which is the most criticized of the Gospels, is only plus 65. And there are plenty of data, say Craig Blomberg's Reliability of John volume, Craig Keener's 2-volume commentary on John with, what's the figure? 20,000 classical references. He's coming out with a book of Acts pretty soon, which is so large he had to leave the one company and go to another one because they couldn't publish this larger book on Acts. It's going to be huge. I think his manuscript's a few thousand pages. With I think I've heard 100,000 classical references in Acts. We've got really good data, but the dates are close, and we've got people who are in the right place at the right time. And critics will usually say, well, Mark's good, John's not as good. And they'll act like by the time you get out here to 95 AD, they'll act like, that's so long. That's plus 65. Well, think about that. I heard not terribly long ago about a fellow who was writing memoirs of World War II. This was in the 90s. And nobody would say, you're a liar. Nobody can remember that material that long. People are still doing memoirs of Vietnam. That's fairly common. What about classical history? I can go on about this all day because this is incredible. One of the best-known personages in the ancient world is Alexander the Great. Do you know that there were about 5 writers who knew Alexander, eyewitnesses, early eyewitnesses who wrote about him? Here's the problem. None of their writings are in existence. None. That'd be like telling you we have 4 Gospels and none of them exist. That's not terribly helpful. Now, Alexander still has about that many more writers. The best known 2 are Plutarch and Arrian. You know when they wrote? Over 400 years after Alexander. If that's Alexander down there, ground zero, I would be off the stage and through that door. And you're going to tell me 65 years is too long after the event to remember things? What about 55? This is using their dating. And 50. And what about 35 with the Gospel of Mark? You say, well, all right, maybe Alexander isn't the best example in the world. Let's use a contemporary of Jesus so we can still use that starting point. Let's use Tiberius Caesar, who dies just a few years after Jesus does. Tiberius has less sources of information than we have for Jesus. You go, yeah, well, you're using the New Testament. Okay, fine. Let me tell you something. First of all, skeptics use the New Testament without exception. That's one thing we don't get in our mind. You go to campuses and people say, oh, you're cheating, you're using the New Testament. How come the atheist New Testament professor I just debated uses the New Testament? It's the best source. But if that's a game you want to play, we can do that. Let's subtract all Christian sources and use just secular sources. We have about double the sources for Jesus that we have for Tiberius Caesar. About double. All right, well, how good are those sources? We have 4 major sources for Tiberius. 4. The first one, this will still be his starting point with Jesus. Sources tell us that he was emperor when Jesus died. The first source is contemporary. Uh-oh, that's really early. But that's our worst source of the 4. Least helpful. Worst is in least helpful. Next best source for Tiberius. And I'm going to have to walk farther than I'm allowed to. The next best source is Tacitus at plus 80. The best source, plus 80. Older than all the Gospels. Next is Suetonius, plus 80 to 85. And the fourth source, Dio Cassius, plus 180. Nobody questions those sources on Tiberius. You go, well, yeah, that's because he's a secular emperor. You're asking us to believe a religious person, and there's like miracles and stuff in the reports. Do you know almost no ancient historian fails to report miracles of people? Thucydides is an example. But Herodotus, the father of Greek history, presents miracles. Tacitus, who doesn't report a lot, but he's known to moralize and to make points that the emperors didn't make in order to get a moral message across. See, that's what critics say is the problem with the Gospels, but almost everyone does it. When I went to Bible college, last night Ergen Cantor was making some comments about my buddy over here, Dr. Norm Geisler. We used his introduction to the New Testament when I went to Bible college for a few semesters. By the way, today, you know, it's a big deal with Bart Ehrman to say there's hundreds of thousands of variant readings in the New Testament. And people are going, oh. I learned in Bible college in 1970 using his intro to the Bible text. I think your figure was 200,000 variant readings? You and Nick's 200,000? I learned that in Bible college. It's not a secret, and it doesn't keep people from coming to faith. Why are we saying things like this is such a slam, you know, on the gospel? It's not an issue. We learn that stuff, and it's there. All right, back to history. We have these sources from a very early time, and when I was in Bible college, not his book, but I was in Bible college, I was taught this. Don't call the Gospels biographies. I was taught that. Don't call the Gospels biography. They're a very special literary genre. Well, you know, when you make that claim and you're trying to do history, that doesn't help us. It doesn't help us to say, this is a very special genre. Nobody knows what it is unless you're one of the initiated. You know, that doesn't really help. About 1990, that whole argument was turned on its head by a classics professor at London, University of London, Richard Burridge. And he argued, and he's won the day in the courts, so to speak. He argues that the New Testament, the Gospels, are actually Greco-Roman biographies. And today, the New Testament Gospels are viewed by most New Testament scholars as biographies. That means the literature is not that strange in the ancient world. You can't say, well, your stuff's not early enough. It's really about as good as you can get in the ancient world. Oh, well, it's that special stuff. No, it's not. It's Greco-Roman bio. What I mean by special is it's followed rules of writing biography at that time, like Plutarch's Lives. So a lot of people would say, these are texts for New Testament. This is where we go for Jesus' resurrection. Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. I'm going to use a different approach today because in the minimal facts argument, I told you I'm using data which are almost entirely allowed by critical scholars. And number two, they are allowed for a reason, good reasons. Critics wouldn't allow these facts without multiple reasons, and we've got them. So from this point on, I'm going to be using data. They don't always share this data about the gospel. Some of them do. I'd highly recommend Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, trying to put an eyewitness basis behind the Gospels. But he's good. I heard he just retired, I'm not sure, but he was at Cambridge University until just recently. And he's writing to argue that the Gospels are a great basis. Not all the critics agree with that, but I'm going to use an argument with which every critic agrees. How's that? I'm going to step down here, earlier in the line. I'm going to use the Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians, and everyone puts 1 Corinthians at about 55. Some put it at 53, some at 56. Doesn't make a difference if you're liberal or conservative. You can pick an early or late date. Let's just say 55. This is plus 25. Paul says, verse 3, I delivered unto you that which I also received. You go, okay, that's interesting. Not too difficult. Go on. No. Let's stay here for a moment. I gave you what I was given. Okay, you don't need a PhD to understand that. Let's move on. No, listen. We've got to stay here for a moment. This is very, very important. There are dozens of places in the New Testament, many of which the author says things like, I got this from somebody else. Or they say, here's a trustworthy saying. Or here's something passed down from the elders and you should pass it to your elders. Over and over again we see that in the New Testament. And that's how you teach. That's how you pass. Remember Paul telling his followers to pass these things on to those who will pass them on and so on? That's very, very important. But the phrase here, this is Greek, obviously, in the original. But the Aramaic equivalent, what was Paul? A Pharisee. What did he study? Scripture. He basically had a PhD in Old Testament. He was a scholar who was going out to persecute people whose lives didn't come into accord with what he thought was the Old Testament interpretation. Good scholar. Because he's a Pharisee, we know the Pharisees taught by passing on tradition. Bingo. Paul said he's a Pharisee. That's how you do history. That's how you pass on tradition. And the key is trustworthy people, early eyewitnesses. How do you know George Washington was the first president of the United States? That's how you do that kind of research. Now keep in mind something else. Scholars today think that most of Jesus' audience, in the neighborhood of 70 to 90%, was probably illiterate. What do you do with an illiterate audience if you want them to remember your message? Well, one good thing to do would be to tell stories. I'll bet you remember a few of Ergen Cantor's last night. You tell stories. And if they're stories with a kicker, stories with a memorable theme, you remember the story. It's like memorizing music. It's like singing a hymn. It's like, something that really touches you. When it has a theme, you memorize that theme. That's one way to do it. You tell a story. And of course, Jesus told parables. The other thing you do is you teach in short, pithy teachings that are easily memorizable. A lot of work has been done on how Jews were very well equipped to memorize. Way better than we are. And you could be illiterate and memorize a text. And in the Greek, as many other New Testament texts are, in the Greek, what Paul says after 1 Corinthians 15, beginning in the middle of verse 3 there, he says, I delivered unto you that which I also received. And from this point on, it reads in the Greek like this. It reads like da 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 da. The second stanza, da 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 da. And it's often set off as a stanza with indented words. And Paul says, I delivered unto you what I received, how that Christ died. Notice Christ. The man's name is Jesus. Christ was not his last name. Christ is a title. Other times Paul does this. Romans 1, 3, and 4. He says Jesus was shown to be Christ, Lord, and Son of God. That's Messiah, Lord, Son of God by virtue of his resurrection from the dead. That's another one of those creedal texts. Here's another one.